the World Trade Organization replaces an earlier organization, GATT. The World Trade Organization came into being through several rounds of negotiations. The Uruguay round was the one that founded it. And it's an organization of states in theory. In practice, it's an organization run by the richer and more powerful states and the multinational corporations that are closely linked to them. And it's the arrangements at the Uruguay round were set up. They're kind of a mixture of liberalization and protectionism, carefully crafted to ensure the wealth and power of the more privileged sectors that basically run it. So there are many strongly protectionist elements, and there are other liberalizing elements, and they're crafted in the interests of the founders. And you can see it by, say, comparing comparing the rules that were set up in the GATT system. So the United States is obviously the most powerful by far. So back in the 1950s, the U.S. insisted on various protectionist devices for agriculture and textiles and so on. Right now, it happens that the U.S. is in a position where its own agribusiness and biotechnology will gain at the cost of others if those barriers are reduced. So therefore, the World Trade Organization changes the system so as to favor liberalization of, say, genetically engineered foods and so on, because that's in the interests of U.S. producers. 30 years ago, it was the other way around. The multi-fiber agreement, which is a highly protectionist element that blocks production from the poor countries through tariffs, that stays. I mean, theoretically, it's going to disappear sometime, but it stays. However, the most extreme protectionist element that was introduced, again, at the insistence of the United States and agreement of the other rich countries, is what's called intellectual property rights, which is not only highly protectionist, but is designed to prevent development and innovation, to ensure that that the technology of the future in pharmaceuticals, software, etc., will remain in the hands of the huge publicly subsidized corporate systems of the West, primarily the U.S., but others too, instead of being freely available. And various measures were introduced to which are, as I say, not only highly protectionist, but designed to prevent growth and development. So, for example, the institution of what are called product patents instead of process patents is quite significant. That means that if, say, Merck Pharmaceutical develops some technique to produce a drug, under process, you could, under the earlier regime, patent the process. But if somebody figured out a smarter way to make it, you couldn't patent the product. They could make it that smarter way. Suppose, say, in India or Brazil or somewhere, they figured out a cheaper way to make it, they could do it. Now that's blocked too, in an effort to prevent progress and development, but to increase profits through protectionist measures. This is now having a big issue, primarily because of things like, the AIDS epidemic in Africa, the spread of malaria and other things. All the drugs are priced out of sight because they're not being sold at market prices. They're being sold at highly inflated prices due to the monopolistic protectionist measures introduced through the World Trade Organization arrangements. And there are many things of this kind. Where the other crucial aspect of the Uruguay round is that it extends further something which has been going on for some time, and that is the transfer of rights, all rights, in fact, away from people and into the hands of corporate entities. So early in this century, corporations were, by judicial activism, granted, not legislation, granted the rights of persons. So they became persons. Of course, they're not persons. They're collectivist entities. They're actually private tyrannies is what they amount to. But they were given the rights of persons. It's a great attack on classical liberalism, on the theory that rights inhere in people. But now these new arrangements extend that. So under the World Trade Organization rules, and not only them, corporations have rights way beyond people. For example, you and I don't have the right to, say, sue Canada if Canada is doing something we don't like. But the Ethel Corporation has the right to sue Canada if Canada's blocking distribution of some probably carcinogenic additive that they're producing. And similarly, all sorts of such arrangements. And these conflicts, if they come to arbitration under World Trade Organization rules, the arbitration is designed so that the corporations always win. In effect, I mean, don't say that, but that's what it comes down to. The arbitration is not a judicial proceeding. It's not public. There's no adversary proceedings, nothing like that. It's a secret proceeding carried out by what are called trade experts. We can guess who they are. And they come down with a ruling, and you can predict what the ruling's going to be. And there's case after case where it works the way you'd predict. The idea is to eliminate the democratic right of people to decide what they want to eat, or what they want to breathe, or what kind of country they want to live in, or whatever, and to transfer that right into the hands of the private tyrannies, investors, lenders, and so on, banks, under the guise that this protects trade. Now, trade may be good or may be bad, but it's not a fundamental value. It's not a fundamental human right to have international trade by General Motors. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but to elevate it to the rank of rights is ludicrous. It's whether it's good or bad is an instrumental question. The question is, how does it affect people? And that turns out to be pretty complicated. But if it's raised above all other values in this highly nuanced way, so sometimes protectionism insist on protectionism, sometimes you insist on freedom of investment, freedom of capital flow, all depending on who benefits. Then of course it's a major attack, and intended as a major attack on human rights, on democracy, on the rights of peoples to decide what they want. So for example, if Europeans decide, let's say, we don't want to be experimental subjects, they don't have that right anymore. So for example, suppose that the biology department at MIT told you, you're going to be an experimental subject. We want to fiddle around with your brain or something. Supposedly, you're supposed to have the right to say, well, I'm sorry, I don't want to be an experimental subject. But the World Trade Organization rules are designed so you don't have that right. So, for example, if Europeans decide, look, we don't want to be experimental subjects with genetically modified foods because just too much uncertainty and nobody knows what's going to happen, and we don't want to be experimental subjects. We would like to make our own decision. Well, that is a right that's taken away under these rules. The corporate Monsanto, for example, can bring a case to the World Trade Organization and claim interference with their divine right to invest and trade freely. And that goes to a secret panel, which, of course, decides in favor of the corporations. Now, then the U.S. is permitted to retaliate. That's the way it works, and that's supposed to show that everybody's equal. So, for example, if Haiti, let's say, brings a case against the United States for dumping chicken parts in Haiti and destroying the chicken parts industry, as the U.S. does, in fact, and it destroys it. They can bring a case. They can use anti-dumping rules to prevent the United States from doing this, and they can, to punish the United States, for example, they can close off the Haitian market, which will really hurt the United States badly, and the United States can do the same to them. Well, okay, we know how that's going to come out. So the U.S. can impose penalties on Europe and it can impose penalties on Haiti and Kenya, and they can do it back to us. But this isn't even a joke. Beyond this, last point about this, the evolving rules, which are in the World Trade Organization and other arrangements, give corporations what are called the right of national treatment, meaning if General Motors operates in Mexico, they have to be treated like a Mexican business. On the other hand, that's a right that human beings don't have. So if a Mexican comes to New York and says, I'd like to have national treatment, don't have to say what'll happen. It's another respect in which the system is designed so that human rights are marginalized in favor of the rights of private tyrannies within a complicated way. And certainly one might ask why this whole organization is needed at all. Is it doing anything that GATT wasn't doing? I mean, during the GATT period, which is since Second World War, in the 1950s and the 1960s, trade growth increased fast. In fact, it increased faster than it's been increasing in the last 20 years. And that was just a different arrangement, of the powerful states, but not this one. There's no particular reason to believe that this was needed for anything except to ensure and enhance the rights of the designers, the rights and power of the designers in ways of the kind that I've mentioned. I mean, the linkage between the powerful states and the wealthy corporate structures is very tight in all sorts of ways. And state power is, especially in the last 30 years, has been designed in order to extend to diminish the rights of people and to extend the rights of private power. It's done in lots of ways. I mean, for example, liberalization of capital flow, which is maybe the most important decision of the last 50 years in international affairs. In the early 1970s, primarily through U.S. initiative, but other major powers came along. There was a breakdown. The Bretton Woods system, the post-war international economic order, was essentially dismantled. That order was crucially based on the right of states to control capital flow in and out, and relatively fixed exchange rates, so you don't have speculation against currencies. That was dismantled. There are a lot of reasons for it, but in any event, it was a decision to dismantle it. It wasn't a law of nature. And as it was dismantled, it had the expected effects. One effect was that it slowed down. It was correlated with. I should say nobody understands the international economy enough to be able to use cause-effect terminology. All you can talk about is what happened. So there's no good models of financial markets and so on. But what happened was, as was predicted, in fact, by the founders of Bretton Woods around the 40s, that it slowed down growth, productivity, increased inequality, slowed wages down, and so on. It had these general negative macroeconomic correlates and probably consequences. But the other effect was not even in question. The founders of Bretton Woods, it was at that time the U.S. and Britain, recognized clearly that free capital flow would undermine democracy. I mean, that's almost trivial. If investors and banks and so on can move capital in and out of a country freely without constraints, they can set policy. They basically determine policy. They're what's sometimes called a virtual parliament. Like if some country's trying to, say, stimulate its economy or to carry out what investors regard as irrational policies, like, say, improving health or education or something like that, protecting the environment, well, you can punish them. Just defund the country. Drive up interest rates by pulling out money, which will slow down the economy and lead to a recession, and in effect terminate the policies. So allowing free capital, it was well understood in the 1940s. This is perfectly explicit in the planning for Bretton Woods. I'm making it up. It was understood, and it's kind of obvious, that unless a country can control its own capital, basically, with constraints on export of capital, with decisions about, under what conditions people can invest. Do they have to have, local privileges for, say, particular areas where you want to invest, or for minorities or women or something like that. Unless you have such constraints, the decision on how your country will run will be in the hands of concentrations of international capital, not in the hands of its own population. So it's a weapon against democracy. At the time, in the 1940s, there was just overwhelming popular support around the world for, including the United States, for essentially social democratic policies, what we call a welfare state. Policies designed to, government policies designed for the welfare of the population. There was enormous popular support for that, and in fact even more radical alternatives, like dismantling private ownership. And there was a lot of fear about that, and the Bretton Woods system was designed to protect those rights. It's sometimes called embedded liberalism. Liberalism meaning free trade, but embedded in sort of what we call welfare state measures, or social democratic measures. And of course, ever since then, the business world and the governments, which are close to it, have been trying to dismantle that system, naturally. And they've been doing it in all sorts of ways. But the elimination of the constraints on the liberalization of capital flow was a big change, and it had the predicted effect. You can see it all over the world, from the United States, Britain, Germany, Sweden, third world. It's just a disaster. The welfare state measures are declining in the interests of concentration of wealth. The United States is a pretty clear case. This was always a very limited welfare state by international standards, like it's the only industrial country with no health care system, for example. But it had, there were measures, kind of New Deal style measures, and they increased in the 60s. But since the early 70s, they've been taken apart to a large extent. People are fighting for them and maintaining a lot of them, but they're considerably weakened, and you can even see it in just wages. So, for example, for the majority of the population, wages have either stagnated or declined since the early 70s. What wealth has been produced is much more highly concentrated than in the past, and a lot of it's kind of shaky. It's stock market inflation, it's asset inflation. But there are similar effects throughout most of the world. For the third world, it can be catastrophic, and often is. And those are the natural, expected, anticipated, and certainly planned effects. Not too surprising to see them happen. The World Trade Organization is, part of this much more general system. Its design is to exalt the right to invest and to trade as the most supreme human value, but carefully nuanced, so there are strong protectionist elements, and to subordinate everything else to that. Well, no wonder that a huge number of people around the world don't like it. You can't take global polls, but probably the majority, in places where you can take polls, it's the majority of the population is opposed, for good reasons. Good organization and education, but the population has been opposed all along. Take, say, NAFTA. When the intent was in 1992 to ram NAFTA through in secret. The signing of the treaty by the three presidents got virtually by the three executives got no publicity, but it's kind of broke into the public arena briefly. And then came a huge propaganda campaign to try to convince people to be in favor of it, and enormous. All the media were probably 100% in favor, close to it, a no-brainer. Economic models proving how marvelous it's going to be. It was a massive campaign. Interesting effect is it didn't change people's minds. At the time of the NAFTA vote, the population was still opposed. They didn't know why, for the most part, because there was no discussion, or In fact, one of the most striking things is that the position of organized labor was never made public. I mean, labor did have a position, an official position, but it was never publicized. In fact, to this day, it hasn't been made public. Rather, they were kind of denounced as, crude, vulgar nationalists with the bullying tactics and so on. Denounced from what's called the left, like people like Anthony Lewis in the New York Times. But their actual position was never made public. And their actual position was quite constructive, in fact. It makes sense to go back and read it, but it never reached the public. They never heard about it. In fact, maybe even more remarkable in a way, Congress had, it's since been killed, but it had an independent research bureau, the Office of Technology Assessment, and they had an analysis of NAFTA, which was very critical. They predicted that it would be harmful to the populations of the three countries and suggested a redesign in ways which would be beneficial not just to investors but also to people. And in fact, their position was very much like the labor position, but that was suppressed too. As far as I know, it still hasn't been made public. But despite the attempt to conceal to suppress any debate or discussion, and to keep people basically in the dark, even of not knowing major positions, nevertheless, public opposition continued, and it was still a majority at the time of NAFTA. Same in Canada. Mexico's a dictatorship, so you can't really be sure what public opinion was. But there were large-scale protests, not just of the general population, but business protested because middle-sized business recognized they're going to get wiped out, and so on. Very little of that was ever reported here. So it was true of NAFTA, and it's been true of every trade agreement since. It must have been, fall of '97, I guess, when they tried to ram through fast track. Again, there was like close to 100% support, elite support, media, business, and so on. But they could not get it through. And the reason they couldn't get it through was described sort of ruefully by the Wall Street Journal, who was, of course, strongly in favor of it. They said that the opponents of fast track have what they called an ultimate weapon, namely the population's opposed. And we haven't quite figured out how to deal with that PR problem. So people were banging on the doors of their local representatives and demanding they vote against it. And finally, it was voted down even by people in Congress who were in favor of it because of constituent pressure, without anything much of an articulate voice. And the same thing happened shortly after with the multilateral agreement on investments. It was intended to be kept secret. It was negotiated for several years in virtual secrecy. It wasn't really secret, so the business world knew all about it and was publishing monographs and so on. The newsroom certainly knew about it. But there was virtually nothing published. I actually did a review of the media in several countries, and it's amazing how tight the discipline was. Finally, it kind of broke through, first in Canada, through the internet and in other ways, and there was as soon as it got known at all, within months, there was a very substantial protest, grassroots organizations and activists and so on, and they forced the OECD to back down on it. And the OECD, the roughly 30 richest countries in the world, and the major corporations and the media and so on, that's a huge concentration of power, and nothing like it in world history. But they had to back down in the face of grassroots activism and organization. Well, that was 1998. It's a year before Seattle, so this shouldn't come as a big surprise. I mean, what happened was that there was enough very effective organization and educational programs and so on, so that people were out there in the streets. But it's a further development of the same very natural phenomenon, a reflection of the opposition to the dismantling of democratic structures and the attack on human rights and so on. What has to be done is to build on it. I mean, the corporate power and state power isn't going to go away, isn't going to go home. They're going to continue trying to implement the same decisions. The Seattle protests did bring together a very dramatically a wide range of constituencies, international, domestic, and so on, which have rarely had to do anything with one another before. If that can be used as a basis for constructing a really powerful international popular movement of many coming from many different parts of society, that can really be a way of changing a lot of things, not just the WTO, but lots of more fundamental things. The drugs are priced out of sight because they're not being sold at market prices. They're being sold at highly inflated prices due to the monopolistic protectionist measures introduced through the World Trade Organization arrangements. And there are many things of this kind. Where the other crucial aspect of the Uruguay round is that it extends further something which has been going on for some time. That is the transfer of rights, all rights, in fact, away from people and into the hands of corporate entities. So early in this century, corporations were, by judicial activism, granted, not legislation, granted the rights of persons. So they became persons. Of course, they're not persons, they're collectivist entities. The World Trade Organization replaces an earlier organization, GATT. The World Trade Organization came into being through several rounds of negotiations. The Uruguay round was the one that founded it. And it's an organization of states in theory. In practice, it's an organization run by the richer and more powerful states and the multinational corporations that are closely linked to them. And it's the arrangements at the Uruguay round were set up. They're kind of a mixture of liberalization and protectionism, carefully crafted to ensure the wealth and power of the more privileged sectors that basically run it. So their measure is a highly protectionist element that blocks production from the poor countries through tariffs. That stays. I mean, theoretically it's going to disappear sometime, but it stays. However, the most extreme protectionist element that was introduced, again, at the insistence of the United States and agreement of the other rich countries, is what's called intellectual property rights, which is not only highly protectionist, but is designed to prevent development and innovation, to ensure that the technology of the future in pharmaceuticals, software, etc., will remain in the hands of the huge publicly subsidized corporate systems of the West, primarily the U.S., but others too, instead of being freely available. And various measures were introduced to which are, as I say, not only highly protectionist, but designed to prevent growth and development. So, for example, the institution of what are called product patents instead of process patents is quite significant. That means that if, say, Merck Pharmaceutical develops some technique to produce a drug, under process, you could, under the earlier regime, patent the process. But if somebody figured out a smarter way to make it, you couldn't patent the product. They could make it that smarter way. Suppose, say, in India or Brazil or somewhere, they figured out a cheaper way to make it. They could do it. Now that's blocked too, in an effort to prevent progress and development, but to increase profits through protectionist measures. This is now having a big issue, primarily because of things like, the AIDS epidemic in Africa, the spread of malaria and other things, all strongly protectionist elements. And there are other liberalizing elements. And they're crafted in the interests of the founders. And you can see it by, say, comparing comparing the rules that were set up in the GATT system. So the United States is obviously the most powerful by far. So back in the 1950s, the U.S. insisted on various protectionist devices for agriculture and textiles and so on. Right now, it happens that the U.S. is in a position where its own agribusiness and biotechnology will gain at the cost of others if those barriers are reduced. So therefore, the World Trade Organization changes the system so as to favor liberalization of, say, genetically engineered foods and so on, because that's in the interests of U.S. producers. 30 years ago, it was the other way around. The multi-fiber agreement, which